Disclaimer. This video contains graphic descriptions of real-life crimes and disturbing subject matter that may be upsetting to some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The events discussed are based on publicly available information and are presented for educational and informational purposes only. This content is not intended to glorify violence, criminal behavior, or any individuals involved. Names, details, and circumstances are presented as accurately as possible. However, some details may be simplified for narrative clarity. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you are sensitive to topics such as violence, abuse, or death, please consider whether this content is appropriate for you before continuing. The friend who never came back.
On a cold November morning in 2022, police officers in Rome, Georgia, would stumble onto a scene that made absolutely no sense. Tucked away from the road, partially submerged in a shallow creek, sat a Toyota Prius. Its position was awkward, almost deliberate, as if it had been guided there rather than crashed. The headlights were still on. The car wasn't running, but it wasn't destroyed either. No shattered glass. No skid marks. No signs of acceleration. It looked less like an accident and more like a question left unanswered. Officers stood at the edge of the creek, trying to understand what they were looking at. Why would someone abandon a perfectly functioning vehicle in the middle of a stream? Why leave it with the lights on? And more importantly, where was the driver? The license plate quickly answered one question while creating many more. The car belonged to 21-year-old Aaron Davis. In a town as small as Rome, Georgia, names travel fast, and officers immediately recognized it. Aaron wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't known to police. In fact, he was the opposite. Recent college graduate, well-liked, responsible, and with a future that seemed wide open. The discovery of his abandoned car didn't just feel strange. It felt wrong. A call was placed to Aaron's father. When Lieutenant Sailor spoke to him, the confusion was immediate and genuine. Aaron had told his family he was heading to Rome to visit friends, then planned to drive on to Alabama to see his girlfriend. That was the last they'd heard from him. He never arrived. His phone went straight to voicemail. And now, his car was sitting in a creek with no sign of him anywhere nearby. To Aaron's father, the situation felt surreal. Nothing about his son's behavior suggested he would abandon his car, disappear without contacting anyone, or put himself in danger. Yet there it was, silent, empty, and inexplicable. As officers arranged for a tow truck to pull the Prius from the water, the questions only multiplied. Inside the vehicle, there were no obvious clues. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No damaged interior. It was as if Aaron had simply stepped out of the car and vanished. That uncertainty was enough for police to escalate the situation. Aaron Davis was officially listed as a missing person. Investigators immediately began retracing Aaron's last known movements. According to his father, the night before his disappearance, Aaron had driven over 60 miles to visit his longtime best friend, Brandon Reiner. The two had known each other since middle school. Their friendship had survived adolescence, distance, and college. Aaron had just graduated from Brigham Young University, and the visit wasn't random. It was meant to be a celebration, a marker of adulthood, of new beginnings, of life finally opening up. But after Aaron arrived at Brandon's house, something went terribly wrong. No one had heard from Aaron since. With that information, police made their first call to Brandon Reiner. When Brandon answered, his tone sounded calm, cooperative, even concerned. He told the lieutenant that he hadn't heard from Aaron either. In fact, he claimed he was actively out looking for him. According to Brandon, the two had been drinking together the previous day. Aaron had become sick, throwing up heavily, and at some point Brandon had gone to sleep. When he woke up in the early hours of the morning, around 1 or 2 a.m., Aaron's car was gone. The story on the surface seemed plausible. A light drinker overindulges, gets sick, leaves in the middle of the night. Strange, yes, but not impossible. Still, the details didn't sit right. Aaron was responsible. His car wasn't found on the road or at a hotel. It was abandoned in a creek. And for over 12 hours, his phone had been unreachable. Police thanked Brandon for the information and ended the call, but they weren't done with him. If Aaron disappeared after leaving Brandon's house, then Brandon was the last person known to have seen him alive. A few hours later, officers arrived at Brandon Reiner's home unannounced. This time it wasn't a phone call. It was face-to-face. Brandon welcomed them inside. His demeanor was unusual. Not overtly nervous. Not emotional. Almost detached. As officers asked him to walk them through the previous night again, he repeated the same timeline. Drinking began around noon. Aaron got sick. Brandon injured his finger on a broken bottle, went to urgent care the next morning, showered, slept, and woke up to find Aaron gone. As he spoke, officers listened carefully, not just to the words, but to what was missing. There was no urgency, no panic, no desperation to find a lifelong friend who had vanished under bizarre circumstances. Police asked if they could search the house. Brandon said yes. As officers moved through the home, they noticed something immediately. Several doors upstairs were locked, specifically the door to the room Aaron had been staying in. That alone raised concern. But when officers asked Brandon to help them access the room, the situation escalated fast. The moment the door opened, the air changed. A strong chemical smell filled the hallway. Cleaning supplies were everywhere. Bottles, powders, soaps. More than anyone would reasonably need. Then officers saw the carpet. There was blood. Not small stains. Not spots you'd associate with vomiting. But large, darkened patches, some dried, some smeared, leading toward the bed. Blood that had clearly been there for hours. Possibly longer. The explanation Brandon had given suddenly collapsed under the weight of what officers were seeing. Throwing up doesn't leave blood pooled beside a bed. Alcohol poisoning doesn't explain extensive cleaning or locked doors. And it certainly doesn't explain why a missing man's car is found abandoned miles away. The tension in the room was immediate and unmistakable. And Brandon felt it. As officers continued documenting the scene, Brandon suddenly bolted. Without warning, he ran through the house, jumped a fence, and disappeared into the neighborhood. Police gave chase, calling for backup, flooding the area, but Brandon vanished. In that moment, the case changed forever. Aaron Davis was no longer just missing. And Brandon Reiner was no longer just a friend.
A father's worst realization.
The moment Brandon Reiner disappeared into the neighborhood, the investigation took on an entirely different weight. What had begun as a missing person case was now racing towards something far darker. Police officers spread out across the surrounding streets, backyards, and alleyways, calling Brandon's name, knocking on doors, and scanning fences and tree lines. But minutes turned into an hour, and Brandon was nowhere to be found. For investigators, there was no longer any doubt. Brandon had run for a reason. As officers regrouped, they shifted tactics. If Brandon couldn't be found, then the next best option was to find someone who knew him better than anyone else. Someone who might know where he would run, what he would take with him, and whether he would reach out. That person was his father. During the neighborhood canvass, an officer encountered a neighbor who happened to be on the phone with Brandon's father, Jeremy Reiner. Without hesitation, the officer took the phone and introduced himself. Jeremy sounded confused, even shocked. As far as he knew, Brandon was still at home. He had no idea police had been there, or that his son had fled on foot. When the officer explained the situation, Jeremy's voice changed. Concern replaced confusion. He insisted that Brandon wouldn't hurt anyone, that there had to be some misunderstanding. The officer didn't argue. Instead, he told Jeremy the truth, that there was significant blood inside the house, and that Brandon was now considered a person of interest in Aaron Davis's disappearance. That conversation planted a seed of dread. Jeremy and his wife immediately began driving toward Rome, Georgia. During the drive, Jeremy tried calling Brandon repeatedly. No answer. No text back. Nothing. Each unanswered call made the silence heavier, more suffocating. At the same time, police continued pressing forward. Officers spoke with Jeremy again over the phone, carefully choosing their words. They explained that while nothing was officially confirmed, there was serious concern that something violent had happened inside Brandon's home. They asked if Jeremy had any idea where Brandon might go if he were scared or trying to hide. Jeremy didn't have an answer, but what he did have, what he would soon discover, would change everything. When Jeremy arrived back at his house, he began searching for anything that might help locate his son. Clothes, notes, anything out of place. That's when he found Brandon's phone. The device wasn't smashed. It wasn't hidden. It was simply there, left behind. For police, this detail would later become critical. People running from law enforcement don't usually abandon their phones, especially not someone Brandon's age. Phones are lifelines, maps, communication, identity. Leaving it behind suggested one of two things: panic or intention. Jeremy stared at the phone, knowing that whatever was inside it could explain everything or destroy what little hope he had left. At this point, Jeremy had been fully cooperative with police. He had answered questions. He had shared details. But now, something changed. When officers asked him to turn over the phone, he hesitated. He didn't refuse outright, but he didn't agree either. As a father, Jeremy was torn apart by what he was beginning to suspect. If Brandon had done something terrible, handing over that phone could seal his fate forever. And yet, not handing it over could delay justice for another family already living a nightmare. When officers spoke to Jeremy again, they noticed the shift immediately. His tone was different. Slower, heavier, like a man processing a truth he didn't want to accept. Police explained that they didn't yet have a warrant to search the phone, but that the messages and data could help locate Brandon and possibly Aaron. Jeremy listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. But he still didn't hand it over. Behind the scenes, officers shared their thoughts openly. The fact that the phone was intact suggested Brandon had given it to his father. The hesitation suggested Jeremy had seen something alarming enough to make him pause. And their instincts were right. What Jeremy discovered on that phone would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later, investigators would learn that Brandon had left behind disturbing writings, notes that read less like messages and more like fragments of a fractured mind. Graphic, violent imagery, obsessive thoughts, lines that suggested pleasure in darkness, control, and destruction. There was even a chilling to-do list, casually written, outlining mundane chores right alongside instructions to explain Aaron's disappearance. Text messages drafted to make the situation seem harmless. Planned lies. Calculated timing. Whether Jeremy read all of it or only enough to understand the truth is something only he knows. But one thing is certain. By the time police spoke to him again, Jeremy knew. An hour later, Jeremy made the call that no parent ever wants to make. He told police he was with Brandon, and that Brandon was ready to surrender. Within minutes, arrangements were made. Officers prepared the station. Patrol cars waited. And not long after, a vehicle pulled into the lot carrying Brandon Reiner, sitting silently beside the two people who loved him most. His parents. As Brandon stepped out of the car, he didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He simply followed instructions, emptying his pockets, allowing himself to be escorted inside. For Jeremy and his wife, the moment was devastating. The realization that their son, the boy they raised, protected, and trusted, was now standing accused of murdering his best friend was almost impossible to comprehend. Inside the station, Brandon was separated from his parents. Officers began the process. Basic questions. Paperwork. Rights. When the detective read Brandon his Miranda rights and asked if he wanted a lawyer, Brandon didn't hesitate. He asked for one immediately. The room fell silent. Brandon wouldn't speak, but his parents would. And what they were about to tell detectives would lead police directly to the truth they had feared since the moment that abandoned car was pulled from the creek.
Inside a fractured mind.
Once Brandon Reiner requested a lawyer, the interview room went quiet. Investigators knew that whatever answers Brandon might have provided would not be coming freely. But silence from a suspect doesn't stop an investigation. It simply forces it to move elsewhere. And in this case, the truth was waiting in the people who knew Brandon best. Detectives turned their attention back to Jeremy and his wife. As parents, they were exhausted, shaken, and visibly overwhelmed. Hours earlier, they believed their son was missing or confused. Now, they were sitting inside a police station, confronted with the possibility that Brandon had committed an unthinkable act against the person he once called his best friend. The detective began carefully. No accusations, no pressure, just questions about Brandon's life, his behavior, his mental state, and what the days leading up to Aaron Davis's disappearance had been like. Jeremy explained that Brandon had recently been brought home from college. Not because of academic failure, but because of mounting anxiety, panic attacks, disturbing thoughts, visions that Brandon claimed he couldn't control. His parents believed they were doing the right thing, bringing him home, getting his medications adjusted, trying to stabilize him. They spoke about Brandon's childhood, his diagnosis, his obsessive tendencies, his intense internal world. Jeremy emphasized that Brandon wasn't violent, at least, not that they had ever seen. He framed his son as someone struggling, not someone capable of murder. But as the conversation continued, detectives noticed something important. Jeremy wasn't just explaining Brandon's past. He was justifying it. There is a subtle difference between providing context and building a defense. And in that room, it was clear which direction the conversation was leaning. The detective understood what Jeremy was trying to do: plant the groundwork for a possible insanity defense. Whether consciously or not, Jeremy was trying to save his son. Still, the detective listened, because buried within those explanations was information far more valuable than any confession. Jeremy revealed that earlier, Brandon had called him in distress. He mentioned blood in the house. He claimed Aaron had thrown up severely. He implied something had gone wrong, but stopped short of explaining what. Then Jeremy said something that made the room change. He knew where Brandon had taken Aaron. He described a cemetery. Old, secluded, tucked away behind a tree line. A place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. The detective didn't react outwardly, but internally, everything clicked. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was direction. With that information, police immediately mobilized search teams. Squad cars rolled out. Flashlights, shovels, and K-9 units were prepared. Every officer involved understood what they were likely about to find, and what that meant for Aaron's family. The cemetery was quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy, as if the ground itself is holding its breath. Officers moved carefully, scanning the terrain for signs of disturbed earth. It didn't take long. Behind the cemetery, in a secluded area shielded from view, they found a patch of soil that didn't belong. The ground had been recently disturbed. As officers began to dig, the reality set in fully. This wasn't a rescue mission. It hadn't been for a while. Aaron Davis was found buried there. His body was wrapped in bed sheets, the same sheets he had slept on inside Brandon's home. That detail alone told investigators everything they needed to know about what had happened before Aaron ever left that house. The hope that Aaron might still be alive vanished in an instant. The missing person case was over, and the homicide investigation was complete. Officers secured the scene, documenting everything. The location, the condition of the body, the method of concealment. Each detail built a clearer picture of the crime, and each one pointed back to Brandon Reiner. Back at the station, Brandon was officially placed under arrest for the murder of Aaron Davis. Despite the gravity of the charge, Brandon's behavior was unsettling. He didn't break down. He didn't lash out. He followed instructions calmly, almost mechanically. Officers later noted how emotionally detached he appeared, how unfazed he seemed by the reality of what was happening around him. For investigators, that calm wasn't comforting. It was chilling. Meanwhile, detectives continued piecing together the psychological trail Brandon had left behind. The writings discovered on his phone painted a disturbing portrait of his inner world. Graphic imagery, grandiose thoughts, obsession with control, darkness, and sensation. Statements that blurred the line between fantasy and action. Some messages were poetic. Others were grotesque. Together, they suggested someone spiraling, someone losing their grip on reality while still maintaining enough clarity to plan, clean, and conceal. That contradiction mattered, because it spoke to intent, and intent would matter in court. Officers knew the defense would likely argue mental illness, insanity, lack of control. But the evidence told a more complex story. Brandon had attempted to clean the scene. He locked doors. He fabricated a narrative. He fled when police grew suspicious. He buried a body. Those are not the actions of someone unaware of right and wrong. Those are the actions of someone trying to get away with murder. As night fell, another duty awaited law enforcement, one that no amount of training ever makes easier. They had to tell Aaron's parents. The words no parent should ever hear were delivered quietly, respectfully, and without unnecessary detail. Aaron was gone. He had been killed, and the person responsible was someone they trusted. Someone he trusted. Aaron Davis had just graduated college. He had plans, dreams, a future that ended not in an accident or illness, but in betrayal. And for the first time since the Prius was pulled from that creek, there was no mystery left. Only loss, only accountability, and only one question that would now remain unanswered forever.
Why?
The defense falls apart.
With Aaron Davis's body recovered and Brandon Reiner formally charged, the case entered its most clinical phase, the courtroom. Emotion would no longer drive the narrative. Evidence would. Every decision Brandon made before, during, and after the murder would now be dissected under the harshest light possible. Prosecutors moved quickly. The charge wasn't accidental manslaughter. It wasn't negligence. It was murder, premeditated, violent, and followed by deliberate attempts to conceal the crime. From the outset, Brandon's legal team signaled their strategy. Mental illness, insanity, a fractured mind incapable of understanding right from wrong at the time of the killing. It was a defense rooted in the statements his parents had already begun making to police: panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, disturbing visions. But the state wasn't interested in diagnoses alone. They were interested in behavior. In court, prosecutors laid out a timeline that stripped away any ambiguity. Aaron arrives at Brandon's house. Drinking begins. Something changes. Blood appears in the bedroom. Cleaning supplies are used excessively. Doors are locked. A story is crafted. And when police grow suspicious, Brandon runs. Each action, prosecutors argued, demonstrated awareness. If Brandon had truly been disconnected from reality, he wouldn't have tried to erase it. The prosecution focused heavily on the cleanup. Chemical agents, powdered cleaners, scrubbed surfaces. These weren't impulsive acts. They were calculated attempts to destroy evidence. Attempts that required time, focus, and intention. Then came the burial. Transporting a body. Selecting a secluded cemetery. Digging a grave. Wrapping Aaron in sheets from the very bed where he had slept the night before. These steps weren't driven by hallucination or panic. They were methodical. And the jury noticed. The defense countered by calling expert witnesses, psychologists who spoke about Brandon's childhood diagnosis, his obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and his reported intrusive thoughts. They painted a picture of a young man overwhelmed by internal chaos, someone whose mind may have fractured under pressure. But cross-examination was unforgiving. Prosecutors asked simple questions with devastating implications. If Brandon didn't understand his actions, why did he lie? Why did he fabricate a story about alcohol poisoning? Why did he flee when police began finding blood? Why did he attempt to redirect suspicion? Why did he bury the body instead of calling for help? There were no good answers. The writings found on Brandon's phone were also entered into evidence. The defense tried to frame them as creative expression, dark poetry, abstract thought, artistic venting. But the prosecution read them differently. They saw obsession. They saw fascination. And more importantly, they saw coherence. These weren't the ramblings of someone detached from reality. They were structured, intentional, self-aware. The to-do list was especially damaging. Mundane tasks, vacuuming, laundry, showering, placed alongside instructions to message others with a fabricated explanation for Aaron's disappearance. It revealed something chilling. Brandon had already begun managing the aftermath. That detail alone dismantled the insanity claim. Behind closed doors, the defense knew it too. As the trial progressed, it became clear that a jury would not be persuaded that Brandon Reiner lacked understanding of his actions. He knew what he had done. He knew it was wrong. And he took steps to avoid being caught. Faced with overwhelming evidence and a collapsing defense, Brandon made a decision. He pleaded guilty. There would be no drawn-out trial. No gamble with a jury verdict. No further exposure of details that would only deepen the wound for Aaron's family. On July 18, 2024, Brandon Reiner stood before the judge to receive his sentence. The courtroom was silent. The judge spoke deliberately, acknowledging the severity of the crime and the irreversible damage it had caused. He addressed the defense's argument and dismissed it plainly. Mental illness, while real and deserving of treatment, did not absolve calculated violence. Justice, the judge stated, required accountability. Brandon Reiner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second chances. No release. No return. For Aaron Davis's family, the sentence did not bring peace, but it brought finality. Their son would never come home. His future was gone, but the person responsible would never walk free again. And for Brandon's parents, the sentence marked the end of hope. The child they tried to protect was gone, not lost, but locked away by his own actions. In the end, this case wasn't just about a murder. It was about betrayal, about the fragile line between thought and action, and about the devastating truth that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of unimaginable harm.
After the verdict.
When the gavel came down and the sentence was finalized, the courtroom emptied slowly. There was no sense of closure in the air, only exhaustion. Justice had been delivered in the legal sense, but nothing about the outcome felt like resolution. A young man was dead. Another would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And two families were left to navigate a reality they never chose. Outside the courthouse, the world continued moving as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. People walked by. But for Aaron Davis's family, time had effectively stopped. Every future milestone they once imagined, careers, marriage, children, had been erased in an instant, replaced by a permanent absence that no sentence could ever repair. Aaron wasn't remembered as a statistic or a headline by those who loved him. He was remembered as dependable, kind, someone who followed through. A recent college graduate who did everything right and trusted the wrong person. Friends described him as loyal to a fault, the kind of person who would drive hours just to spend time with someone he cared about. That loyalty cost him his life. In the days following the sentencing, details of the case spread quickly online. News segments condensed months of investigation into minutes. Headlines focused on shock value: best friend murder, cemetery burial, life without parole. But those summaries stripped away the human cost. Behind every update was a family waking up each day to a reality they couldn't escape. For Brandon Reiner's parents, the aftermath was a different kind of devastation. Their grief was complicated, layered with guilt, confusion, and a quiet, unbearable question that would never have an answer. How did we miss this? They had tried to help their son. They brought him home. They sought treatment. They believed, perhaps desperately, that stability was possible. Accepting that their child was capable of calculated violence meant dismantling everything they thought they understood about him and about themselves. Public opinion was unforgiving. Some viewed Brandon as a monster, pure and simple. Others debated mental illness, responsibility, and whether warning signs had been ignored. But those discussions often missed the point. Regardless of diagnosis, Brandon made choices. And those choices had consequences that could not be undone. Inside prison, Brandon would fade into anonymity. Another inmate serving life without parole. Another name on a list. But the crime would follow him forever, etched into records and memories he could never outrun. For Aaron's family, life became divided into two eras, before and after. Holidays were quieter, conversations more fragile. Grief arrived in waves, sometimes loud and overwhelming, other times silent and suffocating. What haunted them most wasn't just the loss, it was the betrayal. The knowledge that Aaron's final moments were spent with someone he trusted completely. That the danger came not from a stranger, but from a friend he had known for years. Cases like this force an uncomfortable truth into the open. Violence doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with obvious warnings. Sometimes it grows quietly unnoticed until it's too late. In the end, there were no lessons that could undo what happened. No takeaway that could soften the reality. Only the reminder that trust, once broken in the most extreme way, leaves damage that extends far beyond a courtroom. Aaron Davis was more than a victim. He was a son, a friend, a future that should have existed. And while Brandon Reiner would spend the rest of his life paying for his actions, the true cost of that night in November would be carried forever by the people left behind.
The warning signs no one saw.
In the weeks following the verdict, as the headlines faded and public attention drifted elsewhere, one question refused to disappear. How did this happen? Not in a legal sense that had already been answered in court, but in a human one. How does a friendship that began in childhood end in murder? How does a young man with a future ahead of him become capable of such calculated violence? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, were there signs that everyone missed? Psychologists, armchair detectives, and true crime audiences would later dissect Brandon Reiner's behavior endlessly. Every recorded statement, every written note, every moment of body camera footage became material for analysis. But hindsight has a way of creating clarity that doesn't exist in real time. Those closest to Brandon described him as quiet, introspective, intense. He wasn't outwardly aggressive or confrontational. If anything, he turned inward. His struggles manifested as anxiety, obsessive thoughts, and emotional withdrawal rather than rage. To most people around him, he looked fragile, not dangerous. And that distinction matters. Violence is often imagined as explosive and obvious. But in reality, some of the most dangerous internal struggles are invisible. Brandon didn't threaten others. He didn't talk openly about harming anyone. What he did instead was retreat deeper into his own mind. The writings found on his phone revealed a world few had access to. They weren't direct confessions, but they were revealing, filled with dark imagery, self-importance, and fixation on control and sensation. Lines that blurred fantasy and reality. Thoughts that fed on isolation. To mental health professionals, these writings suggested something deeply unstable, but instability alone does not equal violence. That's where the discomfort lies. Millions of people live with anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and intrusive thoughts. The overwhelming majority will never harm anyone. To suggest otherwise is not only inaccurate, it's dangerous. The court made this distinction clear. Brandon's diagnosis did not excuse his actions, nor did it explain them fully. What separated Brandon from countless others struggling with mental health was choice. Choice to act, choice to conceal, choice to flee. Those decisions required awareness, planning, and intent. Friends and family later reflected on moments that felt insignificant at the time. Changes in mood, withdrawn behavior, odd comments, but none of them rose to the level of alarm. There was no clear moment where someone could say, "This is where we should have intervened differently." And that realization is terrifying, because it suggests that some tragedies don't announce themselves. They don't come with unmistakable red flags. Sometimes they grow quietly, unnoticed, in plain sight. Aaron Davis couldn't have known. There was no reason for him to fear Brandon. Years of friendship had taught him the opposite. Trust had been reinforced over time, built through shared memories and familiarity. That trust became the opening through which violence entered. Experts often warn against trying to simplify cases like this into lessons or formulas. Doing so creates the illusion of control, of believing that if you just watch closely enough, you can always prevent the worst outcome. Reality is harsher. Some people hide their darkest thoughts exceptionally well. The tragedy of this case lies not only in the act itself, but in the fact that so many people did what they believed was right. Aaron trusted a friend. Brandon's parents sought treatment. Police followed procedure. And still, the outcome was irreversible. In the end, the warning signs weren't neon. They were whispers. And whispers are easy to miss.
The case that stays with you.
Long after the evidence is boxed up and the courtroom lights go dark, some cases refuse to fade. For the officers and detectives who worked the murder of Aaron Davis, this was one of them. Not because it was the most violent crime they had ever seen, but because of how quietly it unfolded, how ordinary it appeared until it was suddenly anything but. In interviews conducted after the trial, officers spoke less about procedure and more about memory. Certain images lingered. The abandoned car in the creek. The locked bedroom door. The smell of cleaning chemicals. The moment Brandon Reiner bolted from the house, confirming what they already feared. For investigators, that sprint was the moment instinct became certainty. But what stayed with them even more was what didn't happen. Brandon never shouted. He never fought. He never broke down. Even after his arrest, his calm was unsettling, almost rehearsed. Officers described it as emotional absence, a kind of detachment that made the situation feel unreal. In law enforcement, interrogations are often portrayed as confrontational battles of will. This one wasn't. It ended before it began. Brandon asked for a lawyer immediately. He understood the rules. He knew his rights. And he exercised them without hesitation. That decision alone spoke volumes. Detectives didn't resent the silence. They understood it. What troubled them was what the silence implied. Brandon knew the consequences. He knew the severity of what had happened. And he chose not to speak, not out of confusion, but calculation. With Brandon unwilling to talk, officers were forced to rely on fragments, parental statements, digital evidence, physical traces left behind. They built the case without a confession, guided by behavior rather than words. And that behavior told a story no interrogation ever could. Officers later reflected on the parents. Watching a mother and father come to terms with the reality of their son's actions is something few people are prepared for. There was no anger directed at police. No denial once the truth became undeniable. Only grief layered with responsibility and regret. One detective described it as watching a family lose a child who is still alive. That emotional toll doesn't disappear when a case closes. Law enforcement is trained to compartmentalize, but cases involving betrayal, especially between friends, cut deeper. They challenge assumptions about motive, trust, and predictability. Several officers admitted that after this case, they paid closer attention to subtle details in future investigations. Locked doors, overcleaned rooms, stories that technically made sense but felt emotionally empty. Not because those details always indicate violence, but because in this case, they did. And yet, even with all that reflection, there was no sense of triumph. Solving a homicide doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like managing loss. The resolution came too late for Aaron Davis. The best law enforcement could do was give his family answers, accountability, and the assurance that the person responsible would never harm anyone again. That, for them, was the job. Not closure, just responsibility.
The life behind the headline.
When a case dominates headlines for months, it's easy for a name to become a symbol rather than a person. Aaron Davis was often reduced to a single phrase, the victim. But long before courtrooms and crime scene tape, Aaron was simply a young man living an ordinary life, quietly building a future he believed in. Friends remembered him as reliable in a way that stood out. If Aaron said he'd be there, he showed up. If someone needed help moving, studying, or just talking things through, Aaron was the one who answered the phone. He wasn't drawn to attention. He didn't seek drama. He valued stability, relationships, and trust. That trust shaped how he moved through the world. Aaron's decision to drive more than 60 miles to visit Brandon wasn't reckless. It was routine. He believed in showing up for people he cared about. There was no reason for him to anticipate danger, no instinct telling him to turn around. His final night was supposed to be simple. A visit, a celebration, a shared moment marking the transition into adulthood. Instead, it became the moment everything ended. In the months after his death, those who knew Aaron struggled with the contrast between who he was and how his life ended. They spoke about his plans, career goals, long-term relationships, the excitement of standing at the edge of independence. All of it disappeared in a moment that made no sense and offered no redemption. For Aaron's family, remembrance became an act of survival. They chose to speak about who he was, not how he died. To anchor his memory in laughter, kindness, and presence rather than violence. Grief didn't move in straight lines. Some days were manageable. Others felt impossible. But through it all, they held on to one truth. Aaron mattered. Memorials came and went. Flowers faded. Social media posts slowed. But loss doesn't follow public attention. It lingers in quiet spaces, in empty chairs, in unanswered texts, in the instinct to call someone who will never answer again. There was no comfort in knowing the person responsible would never be released. Justice doesn't restore what was taken. It only draws a line and says, this far and no further. Aaron's legacy exists now in memory, in stories told by friends, in the impact he had on people whose lives intersected briefly with his own. He is remembered not for the way he died, but for the way he lived, steady, loyal, and present. And perhaps that is the most important distinction of all.
When the story ends, the impact remains.
Every true crime story eventually reaches a point where there are no new facts left to uncover. The evidence has been weighed, the verdict delivered, the sentence handed down. On paper, the story is finished. But for the people who lived it, the impact never truly ends. Aaron Davis will never grow older than 21. His life was stopped in the space of a single night, cut short not by chance, but by betrayal. The future he worked toward, the relationships he was building, the life he was only beginning to understand were taken from him by someone he trusted without hesitation. Brandon Reiner will spend the rest of his life inside a prison cell. There will be no parole hearings, no second chances. His name will fade from public memory, but the consequences of his actions will follow him forever, etched into records he cannot escape. Two families now live on opposite sides of the same tragedy, connected by a moment that changed everything. One family grieves a son who should still be here. The other grieves a son who is still alive, but unreachable in every way that matters. Cases like this resist simple explanations. Mental health alone does not explain violence. Friendship alone does not prevent it. Trust alone does not guarantee safety. What remains is a difficult truth. Sometimes harm comes from places we never expect, carried out by people we never believed capable of it. There is no lesson that makes this story easier to accept. No moral that softens the outcome. only the reminder that human beings are complex and that darkness does not always announce itself. What endures is responsibility. The responsibility to remember Aaron as more than a victim, to speak his name not in connection with his death, but in recognition of his life. The responsibility to acknowledge that actions, no matter the internal struggles behind them, carry consequences. And the responsibility to approach stories like this not as entertainment, but as reminders of the very real lives affected long after the cameras stop recording. When the story ends, the impact remains. And in the quiet that follows, the names are what matter most. Aaron Davis. Remember him.
Thank you for watching this story all the way through. Cases like this are difficult to tell and difficult to hear, and the fact that you stayed until the end means more than views or numbers ever could. It means you chose to listen, to reflect, and to remember a life that mattered. True crime isn't just about what happened, it's about the people affected long after the headlines fade. By watching, sharing, and engaging thoughtfully, you help keep those stories human, not forgotten. If this video moved you in any way, consider leaving a comment, sharing it responsibly, or subscribing so these stories can continue to be told with care and respect. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your empathy. Stay safe, and remember the names behind the stories.